There was no better metaphor to represent the popular loathing of this Tory government than to see Rishi Sunak announcing the general election in a downpour of rain. It would have been even better as some very skillful and imaginative graphic artists posted on social media if the Prime Minister had been standing ankle deep in raw sewage. It is with a huge sigh of relief that millions of workers will feel they now have a chance of getting rid of the most rotten, corrupt, and incompetent government in modern times. By almost any indicator of well-being, the vast majority of people are worse off than they were 14 years ago. Real wages are around the same as they were in 2010, but still lower than before the COVID pandemic. Public services are on their knees, especially local government, with several authorities declared bankrupt and others set to follow. The NHS is in crisis, with waiting lists for operations and procedures almost tripled. The number of food banks has soared, as have child poverty and homelessness. Buying or renting a home is becoming impossible for young couples. Even highly skilled workers like teachers, junior doctors and nurses are struggling to make ends meet. The public utilities, privatised by Margaret Thatcher and John Major governments, are a national disgrace, pumping billions into shareholders' pockets while gouging prices to record levels. Water companies dump millions of tonnes of raw sewage, making not a single river in England clean. Meanwhile, shareholders laugh all the way to the bank. The UK has the most expensive railway system, mile for mile, in Western Europe. It's little wonder there is wide public support for the renationalisation of these public utilities. And how can voters forget the partying at number 10 Downing Street during lockdown? Or the succession of huge public scandals, the post office, Windrush, infected blood, where compensation for the thousands affected have been endlessly delayed by this government. It is for these reasons that Labour is likely to win the coming election, with the average poll putting them 21 points ahead. On the very afternoon the election was called, Keir Starmer emailed Labour members. Change, he wrote. That is what this general election is about. Change is indeed what would be universally welcomed, but there is widespread scepticism about whether this Labour leader can deliver it. As the chief executive of Ipsos told The Guardian, Starmer's personal ratings are the lowest Ipsos has ever seen for an opposition leader who is so far ahead in overall voting intention. Nevertheless, Labour will carry the aspirations of millions of workers because it is seen as the only viable alternative government. There will be a huge weight of expectation riding on it. Millions will be expecting real change. And if Labour is elected, we will support any reform introduced, however modest, that benefits working class people. But British capitalism, the weakest of all the major capitalist economies, is in such a perilous state that it cannot afford real and lasting reforms. If the Labour leadership bases their economic policies on maintaining this so-called market system, they will inevitably be forced along the road of counter-reforms. Even the best of intentions would give way to a Labour version of austerity. The Starmer/Reeves election campaign will be based on the idea that the Labour leadership has a plan to put matters right. For millions of voters, this will be enough to boot the Tories out. But if there are millions who believe that Labour will bring about real change based on the economic outlook of Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, then they are under an illusion. The greater the majority Starmer has, the greater the weight of expectation on him, and the weaker his excuses for not carrying out changes that improve workers' lives. Let's make one thing very clear. Left Horizons supports the election of a Labour government, especially one with the largest majority possible. This is not because we have illusions in the Labour leadership, but because their outlook can only be challenged in the eyes of the mass of workers by its application in practice. It may only be a first step, but the election of a Labour government is a step towards the reawakening of real socialist ideas inside the Labour Party once again. And for us, that cannot come soon enough.